Christmas Eve in the Colorado mountains lacked screaming or thrown wine glasses. My mother simply executed a quiet, devastating maneuver. She placed the camera into my husband's hand and pulled my sister's polished new boyfriend into the exact spot my husband had occupied for 9 years. The flash fired. The smiles froze. They assumed it was merely a holiday photograph. They had no idea it was the opening shot in the most ruthless retaliation I would ever orchestrate. I am Skylar Nolan, and at 36 years old, I had spent most of my life managing the subtle, invisible currents of my family's expectations. The drive up to my parents' sprawling mansion in Evergreen, Colorado, was usually an exercise in silent, tense preparation. The winding mountain roads were slick with dangerous patches of black ice, but my husband, Owen Mercer, navigated them with the steady, quiet competence that defined everything he did. We were arriving at the annual Nolan family Christmas dinner, an event that conveniently doubled as a high-profile thank you gala for the prominent financial donors of my parents' philanthropic foundation. It was never merely a holiday meal meant for warmth. It was a carefully choreographed performance. Owen parked our unassuming sedan between a long line of imported luxury vehicles. In his hands, he carefully carried a beautifully wrapped box containing a rare bottle of bourbon he had spent over 3 months tracking down for my mother, along with a vintage first edition book for my father, Martin. I carried a warm, rustic pear tart, baked entirely from scratch that afternoon. We stepped onto the massive flagstone porch, brushing the freezing snow from our coats. Before my knuckles could even graze the heavy brass knocker, the grand oak door swung open, spilling golden light into the frigid mountain air. My mother, Celeste Nolan, stood framed in the doorway. She wore a bespoke emerald gown that signaled loudly she was holding court rather than hosting family. She kissed the air near my cheek, her eyes instantly scanning past my shoulder to gauge the arriving cars in the driveway. When her sharp gaze finally landed on Owen, her bright smile thinned into a polite, flat line. She offered him a brief, dismissive nod, taking the expensive bourbon from his hands, as if he were a hired delivery boy dropping off a parcel. She did not express a single ounce of genuine gratitude. Instead, she pivoted sharply on her heel, her voice ringing out over the hum of the opulent living room. She had found her true prize for the evening. My younger sister, Piper Nolan, was clinging tightly to the arm of her newest boyfriend, Dean Holloway. My mother instantly hooked her arm through Dean's other side, physically pulling him away from the coat check and dragging him into the dead center of the grand living room. She wanted to parade him before the sea of wealthy donors and local politicians. Dean was exactly the kind of man my mother had always wished I had brought home. He was aggressively polished, equipped with a slick, blinding smile and a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it looked painted directly onto his frame. He spoke in the smooth, overly confident cadence of a man entirely too used to selling things. He was the gleaming gold standard Celeste loved to display, a walking piece of corporate art that she felt elevated the Nolan family brand. Owen, standing quietly beside me in his comfortable tweed jacket, felt the atmospheric temperature drop. He did not say a single word, but the contrast my mother was forcing upon the room was violently clear. The evening eventually bled into the formal dining room, where a massive mahogany table groaned under the weight of catered silver platters. My homemade pear tart was quietly relegated to a distant side table. The dinner conversation was entirely monopolized by Dean. From the hot soup course to the prime rib roast, my mother peppered him with breathless questions about his latest commercial real estate acquisitions, his firm's projected profit margins, and his visionary plans for urban development. Dean ate the attention up, projecting his voice loudly so the entire table could hear about his multi-million-dollar deals and strategic corporate synergies. Owen, a dedicated documentary filmmaker who spent his life highlighting underfunded community organizations, sat in dignified silence. He listened attentively, he nodded politely, and he focused on his meal. Not once did anyone at that table ask about the powerful film he had just premiered at a prestigious regional festival. Not once did anyone ask about the countless hours he had spent volunteering his skills for my family's own charitable foundation over the years. The only time my mother openly acknowledged him during the grueling 2-hour dinner was when the glare from the antique crystal chandelier began bouncing harshly off the polished dining table. She paused her endless fawning over Dean and snapped her fingers lightly in Owen's direction. She declared that the lighting was entirely too severe and asked if he could figure out the complex dimmer switches in the main hallway. She reasoned aloud that since he was in the video business, he was naturally good with machines and technical lighting. It was a thinly veiled, humiliating demotion from a respected son-in-law to an unpaid on-call technician. Owen merely gave a polite, tight nod, wiped his mouth with his linen napkin, and walked to the hallway to adjust the switches, while the rest of the table continued to laugh loudly at one of Dean's rehearsed jokes. The true fracture, however, did not occur at the dining table. It happened right after dessert, when the highly anticipated annual family portrait was announced. The massive stone fireplace in the grand parlor was ablaze, casting a picture-perfect glow over the towering spruce tree. Celeste began directing the room with the ruthless, commanding efficiency of a public relations manager staging a high-stakes campaign shoot. The wealthy donors were gently shooed toward the open bar. The immediate family was formally summoned to the hearth. For 9 years, the physical arrangement had been an unspoken tradition. My father and I always stood in the back row, while Owen stood directly to my right side, his hand resting warmly on the small of my back. Piper and my mother usually took the front, seated elegantly on the antique velvet chaise. But this year, Celeste abruptly broke the formation. She snatched the heavy digital camera from the mahogany side table and turned directly to Owen. Her voice was bright, entirely devoid of obvious malice, which made the sudden request all the more lethal. She told him to take the camera. She loudly proclaimed that he knew all the absolute best angles and that they desperately needed his professional eye to make sure the lighting he had just fixed looked perfect on film. Before Owen could even process the insulting request, my mother reached out and physically grabbed Dean by the lapel of his immaculate suit. She dragged him right into the open space beside me and my father. She shoved him exactly into the footprint where my husband had stood for almost a decade. My father shifted uncomfortably on his feet, but remained entirely silent, choosing the path of least resistance as he always did. I opened my mouth to object, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs, but my mother cut me off with a chillingly casual justification. She stepped back, framed her hands in the air like a film director, and announced to the room that the back row simply looked much more balanced this way. She claimed the heights matched up better for the composition. It was a masterful, devastating amputation. She had just publicly severed my husband from the family tree and grafted an absolute stranger in his place, all disguised under the thin veil of aesthetic symmetry. The scent of Dean's expensive cologne suddenly filled my personal space, a sickening reminder of the hostile takeover happening right in front of me. I looked at Owen. He stood frozen, holding the heavy camera, the large lens pointing uselessly at the floorboards. He looked directly at me, then glanced at Dean, who was already flashing a blinding, practiced grin at the lens, totally unbothered by the displacement he had just caused. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab my winter coat and pull Owen out the front door into the freezing night, but the large room was completely full of watching eyes, wealthy donors, and silent judgments. Making a scene would only validate my mother's unspoken narrative that Owen was a stubborn mistake I was irrationally defending. So, Owen did what he always did. He absorbed the brutal blow to protect my fragile peace. He slowly raised the camera to his eye. He adjusted the focal ring with practiced ease. He forced a warm, encouraging smile for the group. He told everyone to say Merry Christmas. The bright flash fired once. The flash fired twice. The flash fired a third time. He was a consummate professional. He made sure they had plenty of options to choose from. The room immediately erupted in polite applause, the heavy tension instantly dissolving as my mother rushed forward to view the digital screen, falsely praising Owen for his technical skill. But from where I stood, the visual angle was completely different. The tall, dark window panes stretching along the parlor wall acted as a perfect mirror against the pitch-black winter night outside. In the cold, sharp reflection of the glass, I saw exactly what the rest of the oblivious room missed. The precise moment the third flash faded and the heavy camera lowered, Owen's warm smile died completely. His face went entirely slack, drained of all color and life. His eyes dropped to the floor, carrying a hollow, heavy humiliation that struck me right in the center of my chest. In that brief, unguarded second captured only in the window glass, I finally understood the cold, hard reality of my existence. My family did not merely look down upon my husband. They were actively, methodically paving the road to replace him with someone who looked better on paper. They thought they had just taken a lovely, innocent holiday photograph. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the match I would use to burn their entire carefully curated world right to the ground. I had been groomed for a specific role long before I understood what the title meant. Being the eldest daughter in the Nolan household meant being the designated crisis manager. I was the child who color-coded her academic planners by the 7th grade, the one who never missed a curfew, the one who drafted the frantic apology emails when my younger sister backed our father's luxury sedan into a neighbor's retaining wall. Piper was the hurricane, and I was the Federal Emergency Management Agency deployed to clean up the debris. It was an exhausting dynamic, but it was all I knew, and I performed my duties with a quiet, efficient precision. That lifelong training parlayed seamlessly into my career. I currently serve as the Contractor Compliance Director at the Summit Corridor Development Office, a prominent urban development agency overseeing major infrastructural overhauls across the greater Denver area. My daily professional life revolves around auditing complex bids, sniffing out fraudulent shell companies, and ensuring that multi-million-dollar public projects are not quietly funneled to someone's golfing buddy. I spend 50 to 60 hours a week dissecting power dynamics, analyzing corporate optics, and dismantling sophisticated manipulation. I am paid a very high salary to see the subtle strings attached to every handshake. Yet, for nearly a decade, I had willfully blinded myself to the strings pulling my own marriage apart. I was a ruthless shark in the boardroom, but within the walls of my parents' home, I had allowed myself to become entirely docile. The friction in my family did not stem from dramatic screaming matches or shattered glass. It was much more sophisticated. It came down to a fundamental issue of pedigree. Owen did not come from a lineage of exclusive country club memberships or generational trust funds. He grew up in a solidly working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. His father carried a heavy metal lunchbox to a steel plant, and his mother worked grueling double shifts at a regional hospital. Owen built his own life entirely from scratch, turning a borrowed camcorder into a highly respected career in documentary filmmaking. His work highlighted underfunded community programs and marginalized voices. He was deeply kind, profoundly stable, and possessed a quiet, unshakable self-respect that required absolutely no external validation. That innate dignity was precisely what drove my mother insane. Celeste Nolan understood men who could be bought, men who could be leveraged, and men who needed her approval to feel important. Because Owen needed none of those things, she simply chose not to register him as a permanent fixture in our lives. She never launched a full-scale theatrical war against our relationship. That would have been entirely too gauche for her refined sensibilities. Instead, she treated my husband like a quaint, bohemian phase she was merely waiting for me to outgrow. She looked at him the way one might look at a starter home, perfectly fine for one's 20s, but entirely unsuitable for the long haul. Over the course of our 9 years of marriage, that dismissive attitude calcified into a very specific, insidious type of exploitation. Because Owen was a creative professional with expensive equipment, my family treated him as an on-call, unpaid vendor for the Nolan philanthropic empire. When the foundation needed a tear-jerking promotional video to secure a $100,000 grant, Owen was summoned without hesitation. When they needed a high-gloss tribute montage for my father's retirement from the hospital board, Owen spent 3 grueling weeks locked in his editing bay. color grading footage until his eyes burned. He shot every single charity gala, every silent auction, and every milestone anniversary party. He did it all without asking for a single dime, offering his immense talent as a selfless act of love for me. But in my mother's mouth, the respected title of son-in-law was never once bestowed upon him. To the wealthy board members, the high society friends, and the deep-pocketed donors, he was never introduced as my husband. He was simply introduced as the guy who is good with all this media stuff. He was the help. He was the utility player, permitted to enter the room only if he was holding a piece of heavy equipment that directly benefited the Nolan brand. I can vividly remember a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago where my mother conveniently realized we were out of artisan ice right as the carving of the turkey began. Instead of asking one of the hired caterers, she loudly asked Owen to make the 30-minute drive to the specialty grocer, ensuring he entirely missed my father's heartfelt toast to the family. The contrast was absolutely staggering when compared to how my family handled Piper. My younger sister floated through life on a thick, comfortable cushion of endless indulgence. Over the past 5 years alone, she had bounced between half a dozen expensive vanity careers. She tried being a boutique yoga instructor, an artisanal candle maker, and an abstract painter, abandoning each pursuit the very moment it required actual discipline or hard work. She dated recklessly, leaving a messy trail of broken apartment leases and maxed-out credit cards in her wake. The financial fallout was always quietly and quickly absorbed by my father's checkbook. Whenever I dared to suggest that perhaps Piper needed firm boundaries instead of constant financial bailouts, my mother would wave her perfectly manicured hand dismissively. She would fiercely defend her, claiming that Piper was simply full of life, an artistic, untamed soul navigating an overly rigid world. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Piper's chaotic incompetence was constantly celebrated as youthful vibrancy, while Owen's steady, self-made success was entirely dismissed as a blue-collar hobby, and I let it happen. That is the ugliest, most bitter truth I had to swallow, because I was so deeply conditioned from childhood to be the family peacemaker, the perennial firefighter. I spent 9 years putting out the small, simmering resentments before they could ignite into a real conflict. Whenever my mother conveniently forgot to include Owen's name on a formal dinner invitation, I rationalized it as a simple clerical error by her assistant. Whenever she asked him to skip the expensive cocktail hour to set up microphones for a charity auction, I told him it was just because she trusted his expertise more than the hired audiovisual crew. I frantically sanded down the sharp edges of her insults, repackaging her blatant disrespect as mere personality differences. I convinced myself that keeping the peace was an act of maturity. I refused to see that I was actively participating in a prolonged, systematic campaign to erase my husband's dignity. I had spent 36 years believing I was the smartest person in any given room, the fiercely intelligent woman who could spot a flawed compliance report from 50 feet away. Yet, I had entirely missed the most glaring conflict of interest in my own life. I had allowed my family to use my husband's inherent kindness as a cheap currency, draining his professional worth to fund their charitable vanity. I had been so obsessed with managing the fallout of my sister's mistakes that I became completely blind to the intentional damage my mother was inflicting on my marriage. The incident by the fireplace with the camera was not an isolated breach of etiquette. It was the heavy, crushing culmination of nearly a decade of calculated marginalization. It was certainly not the first time Owen had been shoved to the edges of the frame to make room for someone they deemed more valuable. It was simply the very first time the stark reality of it was stripped of all its polite camouflage, leaving me absolutely nowhere left to hide. The illusion of a happy, eccentric family had finally shattered. I could no longer pretend we were dealing with simple misunderstandings or generational gaps. I was looking directly at a hostile architecture designed entirely to keep my husband on his knees, and the sickening realization washed over me that I was the one who had been holding the door open for them all along. The descent from the mountains of Evergreen was entirely devoid of the holiday warmth we were supposed to have absorbed. The heavy tires of our sedan crunched over the packed snow, the only sound in a car suffocating under a massive, unyielding silence. I kept adjusting the heating vents, pushing the dials up and down, desperately trying to manufacture a sense of normalcy that had completely evaporated the moment the camera flashed. I wanted to speak. I wanted to weave a convincing tapestry of excuses, to say my mother was merely flustered by the large crowd, or that she was obsessively compulsive about visual symmetry. I wanted to pretend the evening had not just crossed a fatal threshold, but the lies turned to lead on my tongue. Owen drove with both hands securely on the leather steering wheel. His gaze locked intensely on the winding, treacherous blacktop ahead. His silence was not simply an absence of noise. It felt like a third passenger sitting heavily in the center console between us, a physical entity demanding to be acknowledged. We drove in this suffocating quiet for nearly 45 minutes before the low fuel chime echoed sharply through the cabin. Owen engaged the turn signal and steered the car into a desolate, brightly lit gas station nestled against a sheer rock wall. The harsh, flickering fluorescent canopy cast a sickly, artificial pallor over the surrounding snowdrifts. He shifted the transmission into park, but he did not immediately reach for the door handle. He sat perfectly still, staring straight through the salt-stained windshield at the concrete pillars. The engine idled with a low, steady hum. The heater fan whirred endlessly. "I know how to take a picture." "Sky," he said softly. I just did not know that after 9 years, I still had not earned a spot inside one. There was absolutely no anger in his voice. There was no raised volume, no theatrical outrage, no bitter sarcasm. If he had yelled, I could have yelled back. If he had cursed my mother's name, I could have defended him and shared in the chaotic adrenaline of a fight. But he offered none of that. The quiet, devastating resignation in his tone was a surgical strike directly to my chest. It was not a flare-up of temporary, hot frustration. It was the solemn, agonizing declaration of a man who had finally accepted a terminal diagnosis regarding his place in my world. He had stopped fighting the reality of how they viewed him. I reached out, my trembling fingers grazing the thick wool of his coat sleeve. "Owen, it was cruel. She was so cruel. I should have stopped her." He turned his head slowly to look at me. The ambient green light from the station signs caught the profound, heavy exhaustion settling deep into the corners of his eyes. "The worst part was not your mother doing what she always does, Skylar. The worst part was not Dean standing there with his catalog smile, pretending he belonged there. The worst part was that you stayed exactly where you were. You let him step right into my space, and you looked straight at the lens, and you smiled." I physically flinched, pulling my hand back as if the wool had burned me. He had not raised his voice a single decibel, yet every word felt like a deliberate physical blow because he was entirely, undeniably right. I had stood there like a decorative pillar in my own life. I had rapidly calculated the social cost of speaking up, weighing the inevitable, ugly public scene against my husband's silent humiliation, and I had chosen the path of least resistance. I had decided, in a fraction of a second, that his pain was a perfectly acceptable tax to pay in order to keep the Nolan family gala running on schedule. For my entire adult life, I had prided myself on being the rational peacekeeper, sitting under the harsh, unforgiving lights of that mountain gas station. I realized I was not keeping the peace at all. I was simply outsourcing the emotional violence to the man I loved, forcing him to absorb the blows so I would not have to bear the discomfort of confronting my own blood. Tears, hot and heavy, finally spilled over my lower eyelids, tracking rapidly down my face. I wanted to launch into a frantic, intellectual defense. I wanted to articulate the decades of psychological conditioning, the sheer paralyzing weight of my mother's expectations, the deeply ingrained habit of mitigating disasters before they ruined a family gathering. But standing on the precipice of losing his respect, I knew explanations were nothing more than beautifully dressed excuses. "I am so incredibly sorry," I whispered, the sound cracking violently in the dry cabin air. "I am so sorry I left you out there alone." Owen sighed, a long, incredibly weary exhalation that seemed to carry the accumulated weight of our entire marriage. He reached across the console and gently wiped a tear from my jawline with the rough pad of his thumb. The profound tenderness of that simple gesture broke my heart far worse than any screaming match ever could have. "I love you, Skylar," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "But I will not force you to choose between me and your family. I am never going to give you that ultimatum." He opened his door and stepped out into the freezing mountain wind to pump the fuel. The heavy metallic thud of the car door shutting reverberated deeply through my bones. He was true to his word. He was not giving me an ultimatum, but in that profound, gracious refusal to demand a choice, I understood the absolute, terrifying necessity of making one. By giving me the freedom to walk away, he had made it brilliantly clear that if I did not actively choose him now, definitively and unconditionally, I was going to lose him entirely. And the bitter truth was, I would deserve to lose him. The remainder of the drive back to our quiet suburban home was spent in a fragile, shared understanding. We did not speak another word about the incident by the fireplace, but the tectonic plates beneath the foundation of my life had already fundamentally shifted. We went to bed that night holding tightly onto each other in the dark, the physical closeness acting as a desperate, temporary tourniquet on a massive emotional wound. I woke up exactly at 7 o'clock the next morning. The pale winter sun was just beginning to bleach the heavy gray sky outside our bedroom window. Owen was still sleeping, his breathing deep and rhythmic, his face finally relaxed from the tension of the previous night. I slipped out from under the heavy down comforter, walked softly down the hallway into the kitchen, and brewed a strong, dark pot of coffee. I sat alone at the kitchen island, the house completely silent save for the hum of the refrigerator. I picked up my smartphone. The screen was already brightly cluttered with dozens of notifications from the family group chat. Most of them were from Piper, sending endless, glowing reviews of Dean's charismatic performance the night before. Analyzing how much the wealthy donors had adored him, I ignored every single one of them. I bypassed the group entirely and opened a direct message strictly to my mother. I did not draft a multi-paragraph manifesto crying about my feelings. I did not unleash decades of pent-up resentment or hurl desperate accusations. Instead, I channeled the cold, precise, and ruthless energy I used when shutting down a corrupt contractor at the Urban Development Office. I typed my message with deliberate care. Owen and I will not be attending the New Year's brunch tomorrow. Furthermore, Owen will no longer be providing any complimentary videography or photography services for the foundation or the family, effective immediately. We need some time to ourselves. I hit send. My pulse hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against my collarbone. I placed the phone face down on the cool marble countertop and wrapped both of my hands tightly around my warm ceramic mug, bracing for the impact. It took exactly 14 minutes for the phone to vibrate harshly against the stone. I did not expect a panicked apology. I certainly did not expect her to ask what was wrong or how she could fix it. Celeste Nolan did not deal in self-reflection. She dealt entirely in power dynamics and strategic leverage. I picked up the device, flipped it over, and read the single line of text she had sent in return. It read, "You are letting momentary emotions destroy long-term relationships." I stared at the glowing letters until the edges of the words began to blur. There was absolutely no warmth in the sentence, no maternal concern, no confusion. It was a thinly veiled threat disguised perfectly as worldly, maternal advice. She was issuing a formal warning. She was telling me that stepping out of my designated, compliant role carried a permanent, devastating cost. She fully expected me to panic, to backtrack frantically, and to apologize for being overly sensitive and ruining the holiday mood. Instead, a strange, absolute calm settled over my entire nervous system. The heavy, suffocating guilt that usually accompanied disappointing my parents vanished entirely, instantly replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She thought she was merely reprimanding a wayward, emotional daughter. She did not realize she had just declared a war on a woman who had spent her entire professional life learning exactly how to dismantle powerful institutions from the inside out. For the next 72 hours, my smartphone transformed into a relentless instrument of psychological warfare. My mother did not respect the boundary I had drawn. She simply chose to pretend the boundary was a temporary malfunction she could forcefully correct. She called 4 times on Monday, letting the phone ring until the voicemail caught it. She called 3 times on Tuesday. When I finally answered on Wednesday evening just to halt the endless buzzing against my coffee table, her voice was dripping with a manufactured, theatrical exhaustion. She did not ask how I was doing. She launched directly into a heavily revised history of the holiday party. She insisted I was spinning a completely irrational narrative out of a harmless logistical decision. She claimed asking Owen to take the picture was practically an honor because he possessed the absolute best eye in the entire room. Putting Dean in the back row, she argued with absolute conviction, was nothing more than a matter of visual composition. She used clinical words like aesthetics, balance, and framing, carefully stepping around the undeniable disrespect of replacing a son-in-law of 9 years with a man she had known for exactly 2 months. She spoke with the smooth, practiced cadence of a defense attorney, making it sound as though I was a hysterical woman manufacturing severe trauma out of thin air. She expected me to crumble, to apologize for overreacting. I simply told her I had to get back to work and disconnected the call. By Thursday, the battlefield had shifted entirely to the family group chat. Piper, never one to miss a prime opportunity to play either the victim or the victor, launched a massive barrage of texts. She accused me of projecting my own deep-seated marital insecurities onto her new relationship. She typed out a long, rambling paragraph suggesting I was simply jealous that Dean integrated into our high society social circle so seamlessly, while Owen still stood awkwardly in the corners after nearly a decade. She called me bitter. She called me rigid. In the past, my physiological response would have been immediate panic. I would have drafted a carefully worded, highly diplomatic response to de-escalate the situation. I would have played the responsible older sister, smoothing the ruffled feathers and absorbing the insult to maintain the illusion of family unity. This time, I sat at my kitchen island, stared at the glowing screen, watched a new message bubble pop up from my mother agreeing with Piper, and slowly pressed the button to leave the conversation entirely. I did not type a single word of defense. The sudden digital silence that followed was shocking, terrifying, and incredibly liberating. The true revelation of that week, however, did not come from my blood relatives. It arrived via a direct text message from Dean on a Tuesday afternoon. His tone was impeccably polite, dripping with the specific kind of slick, corporate familiarity that ambitious men use to fast-track intimacy. He asked how my week was going, made a brief, charming joke about the unpredictable spring weather, and then casually pivoted to business. He mentioned a massive mixed-use housing development package opening up in the metropolitan area. His consulting firm was highly interested in securing a piece of the action. He wondered, purely as a favor between future family members, if I could just take a quick peek at the internal bidding schedule to help him align his financial timeline. It was a request so casually worded it could almost pass as innocent networking at a cocktail party. But sitting at my heavy oak desk at the Summit Corridor Development Office, staring at the screen, the disjointed puzzle pieces snapped together with a terrifying, icy clarity. Dean did not merely care about being the favorite guest at Sunday dinners. The lavish praise, the perfectly tailored suits, the aggressive charming of my mother, it was all an elaborate, highly calculated Trojan horse. He was systematically using the Nolan family name, and my mother's blind, desperate adoration for high-status men, as a backdoor right into the lucrative municipal contracts I oversaw. He thought my family connection made me an easy, compliant mark. I replied 20 minutes later with a sterile, strictly professional message. I stated that all municipal bidding schedules were strictly confidential until publicly released by the City Council, and I provided him with a generic hyperlink to the public government portal. I gave him absolutely nothing he could use. He did not push back. Predators rarely do when they test a perimeter fence and discover it is fully electrified. Instead, he smoothly changed his tactical approach. He replied with a cheerful acknowledgement, thanking me for pointing him in the right direction, and then deliberately shifted the subject to my husband. He praised the lighting Owen had set up at the Christmas dinner, complimenting his aesthetic sensibilities. Then, he dropped the bait. He suggested that once his firm landed their upcoming mega project, he might toss some freelance media work my husband's way. He spoke about my husband the exact way a wealthy general contractor speaks about a reliable local plumber. It was a highly calculated microaggression, a subtle but distinct flex of power meant to remind me of the hierarchy he was rapidly establishing within my own family. He was subtly telling me that he was the one generating massive wealth, and Owen was merely the hired help who might catch a few crumbs from his table. Throughout this entire escalating Cold War, my father remained a complete ghost. Martin Nolan finally called me exactly 2 weeks after the holiday dinner. He did not ask how Owen was doing. He did not address the group chat incident, my sudden departure from it, or my mother's relentless campaign of pressure. He simply asked, his voice thick with exhaustion, if we could all just let things settle down and get back to normal. He sounded so tired, far older than his 62 years. But his pathetic plea highlighted the exact toxic ecosystem of my childhood in brilliant high definition. It was the same pattern repeating endlessly. My mother applied the crushing, uncompromising pressure. Piper generated the chaotic, emotional theater, and my father stood perfectly still, closing his eyes and waiting until the hurricane passed so he would not have to clean up the wreckage. He did not actually want peace. He simply wanted quiet, and he was entirely willing to sacrifice my husband's dignity and my own sanity to get it. I told him I loved him, but I had a meeting to attend, and I ended the call. The weeks bled slowly into months. The heavy winter snow began to thaw, bringing with it the inevitable Easter holiday. True to form, a heavy, cream-colored, embossed invitation arrived in our mailbox exactly 3 weeks before the date, acting as if the past 90 days of complete estrangement had been nothing more than a collective hallucination. Celeste expected us to attend the Sunday roast as if no lines had ever been crossed. When I called her the following afternoon to politely but firmly decline the invitation, the thin, polite veneer finally cracked completely. She did not yell, but her voice dropped to that frigid, devastating register she reserved for ultimate disapproval. She decided to deploy the heavy artillery. She delivered the single sentence I despised more than any other in her vast arsenal of manipulation. She stated, with absolute, unyielding conviction, that Dean knew how to behave better than a lot of people in this family. It was a sentence perfectly designed to cut me straight to the bone. It was meant to provoke me into a desperate, messy defense of my husband and myself, to drag me back into the mud of seeking her approval. But as I held the phone to my ear, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I did not argue with her. I did not explain Owen's worth or my own boundaries. I did not tell her about Dean's highly inappropriate text message regarding the city contracts. I simply told her to enjoy the holiday ham, wished her a good afternoon, and hung up the phone. For 36 years of my life, I had used my silence as a heavy, suffocating blanket to cover up my family's ugly behavior, dimming my own light just to keep them warm and comfortable. But sitting in my quiet living room, listening to the dial tone, my silence fundamentally transformed. It was no longer a tool of submission or a white flag of surrender. It had become a reinforced steel boundary, and for the very first time in my existence, I was standing firmly on the right side of it. Nearly 6 weeks had passed since I formally declined the Easter invitation, and the heavy silence from my family had become a welcomed, steady baseline in my life. The Summit Corridor Development Office provided a sanctuary of rigid rules, transparent ledgers, and absolute order. Here, manipulation was meticulously tracked and penalized, a stark contrast to the emotional warfare of the Nolan household. I was sitting at my desk on a mundane Tuesday morning, reviewing standard infrastructural budgets, when an automated internal compliance flag flashed bright red across my secondary monitor. It was an urgent alert generated by our risk management software regarding a highly contested mixed-use housing redevelopment package slated for the outer Denver suburbs. According to the internal memo, a newly formed consortium of contractors was making aggressive, irregular inquiries, attempting to quietly bypass the standard municipal blind bidding protocols. I clicked the secure link to open the preliminary vendor disclosures. As I scrolled through the dense corporate structuring documents, my blood turned to absolute ice. Buried deep on page 42, listed as a secondary strategic community consultant, was a limited liability company. The name of that specific company was identical to the one Dean had casually dropped in his text message to me months ago. The one where he politely asked me to check the bidding schedules as a favor. The air in my office suddenly felt terribly thin. I rapidly navigated to the executive summary of their submitted pitch deck. My hands hovered over the keyboard as my eyes scanned the introductory paragraphs. A profound, sickening sense of déjà vu washed over me. The language was not merely similar, it was a near-perfect, verbatim replication of a highly specific conceptual framework I had authored exactly 2 years prior. I had spent countless late nights drafting a comprehensive proposal centered around community rehabilitation housing for my family's philanthropic foundation. It was my own intellectual property, tailored specifically for the Nolan donor base, featuring unique sociological terminology I had coined myself. Dean had not just stolen an abstract idea. He had copy-pasted my exact phrasing, right down to the specific bullet points and projected community impact metrics. The reality of the situation hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. Dean Holloway was not simply an arrogant social climber desperate for my mother's high society approval. He was systematically strip-mining my family. He was draining their proprietary data, their philanthropic concepts, and their wealthy network of donors, funneling it all into a high-stakes, fraudulent municipal bid. Worse yet, he was turning me into an unwitting accomplice. Because I was the compliance director overseeing this exact urban sector. His proximity to my sister made me a walking, breathing liability. If this heavily compromised bid moved forward and the conflict of interest was later discovered by the city council or federal auditors, my pristine career would be instantly incinerated. The media would inevitably frame me as the corrupt inside woman feeding municipal secrets to my sister's wealthy fiancé. Dean was building his empire directly over my professional grave. A lesser woman, or perhaps the woman I was a year ago, would have panicked. I would have called Piper and demanded answers. I would have driven straight to Evergreen, kicked the front door open, and thrown the printed pitch deck onto my mother's flawless marble island. But I was entirely finished operating within the hysterical, emotional theater of the Nolan family. I took a deep, steadying breath, closed my office blinds, and went to work. I did exactly what the taxpayers of Denver paid me a substantial 6-figure salary to do. I opened a fresh, heavily encrypted document on my terminal. I began drafting a preemptive, ironclad declaration of potential conflict of interest. I detailed my familial connection to a secondary consultant listed on the bid without showing any emotional bias. I formally recused myself from any auditing, voting, or oversight regarding that specific suburban project, and I immediately routed the memorandum directly to our internal legal counsel. I built an administrative firewall around my professional integrity in under 45 minutes. Then, I began constructing a master investigative timeline. I meticulously logged every text message, every single email, and every event invitation Dean had sent me since the moment he first entered our lives. I printed hard copies and secured them in a locked briefcase. That evening, I laid the entire situation out on our dining room table. I did not need to soften the blow or explain the gravity of the legal threat to Owen. He absorbed the information with the sharp, deeply analytical mind of a seasoned investigative documentarian. There were no emotional outbursts from him, no lingering bitterness about the holiday party or his own marginalization. He saw the predator lurking in the corporate data, and he immediately matched my clinical focus. He looked over the printed pitch deck, tracing a line across my timeline with a yellow highlighter. He noted quietly that if Dean had stolen my white paper from the foundation, it meant he already possessed full, unrestricted access to their internal servers, which meant he had unrestricted access to their entire donor registry, their financial event archives, and their banking contacts. Without saying another word, Owen walked into his home office and returned carrying a heavy stack of high-capacity external hard drives. For the next 72 hours, we turned our quiet living room into a war room. Owen dug methodically through multiple terabytes of archived media. He pulled up every single event calendar, every guest list, and the faces of every wealthy donor he had captured on film over the past 9 years. He printed out the $0 invoices he had submitted to the foundation for his complimentary videography services, establishing a rigid, undeniable paper trail of the foundation's historical operations long before Dean ever stepped foot in Colorado. As we cross-referenced Owen's massive archive of historical data with the public records of Dean's newly formed satellite companies, a terrifying, sprawling relational map emerged on our table. We tracked the sudden, highly strategic shifts in my family's social calendar. The wealthy donors who were deliberately seated next to Dean at the Christmas dinner were the exact same private investors currently listed as early financial backers on his housing redevelopment bid. He was systematically using the Nolan family galas as private, all-expenses-paid fundraising summits for his own corporate entities. The revelation fundamentally shifted the entire axis of my universe. Dean was a highly sophisticated power predator. He understood that immense wealth was usually locked behind heavy steel doors, but fractured family dynamics were the ultimate skeleton keys. He used a whirlwind romance with Piper as his primary entry point. He used flattery and high society aesthetics to completely blind my mother, giving her exactly the kind of shiny accessory she always craved. He used my father's passive, conflict-avoidant nature to operate entirely without scrutiny. He viewed the entire Nolan family not as human beings, but as a vulnerable, deeply flawed infrastructure highly ripe for a hostile takeover. Standing over the dining table late Sunday night, looking at the intricate web of deceit mapped out in red ink, my ultimate objective crystallized into something razor-sharp. This was no longer just a desperate battle to protect my marriage or force my stubborn family to respect my husband. It was infinitely larger than my bruised ego or a ruined holiday photograph. Dean was steering the entire Nolan empire toward a catastrophic legal and financial cliff. If he successfully manipulated this municipal contract using stolen data, fraudulent shell companies, and illicit connections, the ensuing federal investigation would drag my parents and my sister straight down into the abyss. They would lose their foundation, their wealth, and quite possibly their freedom. I did not owe my mother my blind submission anymore. I did not owe Piper my constant, exhausting rescuing. But I absolutely refused to let a slick, opportunistic parasite use my family name as a stepping stone and then leave us all to face the brutal indictments. I was going to let Dean believe he was the smartest man in the room. I was going to let him continue building his elaborate, glittering house of cards. And then, when the stakes were at their absolute highest and the spotlight was shining directly on him, I was going to dismantle him piece by piece. We stopped waiting for the embossed invitations. Once I formally drew the line, Owen and I simply vanished from the Nolan family social calendar. We missed the annual spring gala. We skipped my parents' 38th wedding anniversary dinner at their exclusive country club. Instead of spending our weekends navigating the suffocating, passive-aggressive minefields of Evergreen, we began building a sanctuary of our own. Friday evenings became a sacred, untouchable ritual. We started inviting our next-door neighbors over for backyard barbecues, grilling thick steaks and sharing inexpensive bottles of wine, while the neighborhood children played tag on our front lawn until the streetlights came on. On Saturday mornings, we threw sleeping bags into the back of our vehicle and drove deep into the Rocky Mountains, finding quiet, off-the-grid campsites where the only audience was the whispering pine trees. We hosted small, vibrant dinner parties for our actual friends, filling our home with genuine, uncomplicated laughter. For the very first time in my 36 years, my weekends belonged entirely to me, free from the heavy burden of being the designated family fixer. Without the constant, unpaid demands of my family's foundation draining his creative energy, Owen's career flourished beautifully. By late May, he secured a massive multi-year contract with a highly respected national nonprofit dedicated to urban community recovery. They were paying him a substantial premium to produce a series of feature-length documentaries. Watching him pack his heavy gear cases to film people who actually respected his vision, people who paid his invoices on time and proudly credited his name on the final cuts, was profoundly healing. He was finally being valued for his immense talent, rather than utilized as a free, convenient vendor for my mother's endless cocktail parties. The light returned to his eyes, a steady, confident brightness that had been slowly dimmed by years of subtle disrespect. Simultaneously, my own professional life took a significant, highly visible leap forward. The executive board at the Summit Corridor Development Office recognized my meticulous handling of several massive compliance audits and officially promoted me to Senior Director of Regional Oversight. The new title came with a beautiful corner office overlooking the downtown Denver skyline and a 20% salary increase. When the news of my promotion inevitably reached my mother through the tight-knit corporate grapevine, she did not call to congratulate me. Instead, my father mentioned offhandedly during a brief, strained phone call that she was deeply irritated. My elevation in the corporate world only solidified my independence. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was no longer the obedient, available crisis manager she could summon at a moment's notice to smooth over her administrative or social blunders, and my prolonged absence was beginning to leave a massive, glaring crater in the Nolan empire. For years, I had been the invisible, highly efficient engine keeping my parents' philanthropic vanity projects running smoothly. I was the one who drafted the elegant apologies when Piper insulted a board member. I was the one who cross-referenced the seating charts so rival politicians did not sit together. Without me there to quietly correct the errors, the foundation started to publicly fracture. Through the local charity networks, I heard the messy, embarrassing details. Essential tax-deductible receipts were being mailed out weeks late, infuriating wealthy contributors. The master donor database, which I used to meticulously update every single Sunday afternoon, was horribly disorganized. Major financial sponsors were receiving duplicate invitations or, worse, being forgotten entirely. The elegant, seamless machine my mother loved to show off was sputtering and coughing thick black smoke, simply because the eldest daughter was no longer standing behind the curtain pulling the levers. Meanwhile, Piper was accelerating her relationship with Dean at a terrifying, reckless velocity. She treated speed as a convenient substitute for actual depth, rushing toward milestones as if she were running out of time. Exactly 6 months after that fateful Christmas dinner, my cell phone chimed with a high-resolution image text directly from my mother. It was a photograph of a private, candlelit dinner at a heavily exclusive 5-star restaurant in downtown Denver. Piper was holding her left hand up to the camera lens, her face flushed with champagne, showcasing a massive, ostentatious diamond ring. She was officially engaged. But the second text message my mother sent, arriving just 30 seconds later, was the one that made the hair on the back of my neck stand at absolute attention. It was a forwarded draft of an upcoming press release. Alongside the joyful wedding announcement, the family was proudly declaring that Dean Holloway had been appointed as the lead strategic advisor for Nolan Crest Living, my family's private real estate holding firm. The lengthy press release outlined a brand-new, multi-million-dollar housing initiative that explicitly tied Nolan Crest directly to the foundation's annual holiday donors. I stared at the glowing digital screen, my jaw clenching so tightly my teeth ached. This was not a joyful family milestone to be celebrated. It was a blaring, red-level security siren. Dean was no longer just the charming, pampered boyfriend standing in my husband's designated spot for a holiday photograph. He had successfully manipulated my sister's desperate infatuation and my mother's insatiable ego to secure the actual keys to the financial kingdom. He was embedding himself into the deepest, most lucrative architecture of my family's wealth, blending their clean philanthropic donor money with his highly questionable, heavily leveraged real estate ambitions. He had found his ultimate mark, I knew exactly what the next move on their elaborate chessboard would be, and I only had to wait 4 days for it to happen. My office phone rang loudly on a Thursday afternoon. It was not my personal cell phone. She deliberately called my direct, professional corporate line. When I answered, Celeste's voice was bright, breathless, and entirely stripped of the icy, punishing resentment she had carried since the Easter holiday. She spoke with a manufactured, overwhelming excitement about the upcoming wedding planning, the beautiful venues they were touring, and the exciting new corporate initiative Piper's wonderful new fiancé was launching. Then, she executed the inevitable pivot. She casually mentioned, as if it were a sudden afterthought, that Nolan Crest Living was hosting a preliminary networking luncheon the following week. The explicit purpose of the gathering was to introduce Dean to the city's key urban development officials and zoning commissioners. She let her voice drop into a soft, pleading register, stating that it would mean the absolute world to Piper if her big sister could attend and sit right at the head table with them to show family solidarity. It was a masterful, sickening, and entirely transparent play. She was not calling because she missed her eldest daughter. She was not calling to heal the deep rift she had carved into my marriage. She was calling because Dean desperately needed to legitimize his brand new position. He needed the newly appointed Senior Director of Regional Oversight for the Summit Corridor Development Office sitting publicly beside him, smiling warmly for the press cameras. They desperately needed to borrow my pristine professional reputation to make their new, highly compromised housing fund look entirely credible to the municipal regulators who would soon be auditing it. They did not want me back in the family. They simply wanted to use my name as a golden shield to protect a man who was quietly robbing them blind. It was exactly 42 days after my mother's phone call that my father finally reached out. He did not call my corporate line or my personal cell phone. He used the encrypted messaging application I had forced him to download 3 years ago during a minor security breach at his hospital board. He asked to meet me at a small, independent coffee shop on the industrial side of the city, a place completely outside the polished, high society radius my mother fiercely patrolled. When I arrived at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, he was already sitting in a dark corner booth, staring blankly at a lukewarm black coffee. He looked significantly smaller than I remembered, his posture defeated by a weight he could no longer passively ignore. He leaned across the scratched wooden table and whispered that the preliminary financial projections Dean had submitted for the new housing initiative did not smell right. There were massive, unexplainable gaps in the capital expenditure reports and millions of dollars allocated to vaguely defined operational overhead. I kept my expression entirely neutral, suppressing the overwhelming urge to remind him that I had warned him months ago. I operated under strict ethical guidelines at the development office, and I was not about to compromise my own federal compliance protocols to save him from his own willful ignorance. I explicitly told him I could not, and would not, look at any internal bidding documents or cross-reference them with city ledgers, but as his daughter, I gave him the only lifeline that actually mattered. I leaned forward and told him to quietly hire an independent legal counsel and a ruthless forensic accountant who had absolutely zero ties to the Nolan family estate. I told him not to sign a single additional contract, not to authorize any wire transfers, and to freeze Dean's access to the Foundation's primary operating accounts until every single penny was independently verified. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the door, finally terrified of the monster he had allowed into his home, while my father was finally waking up to the financial nightmare. My husband was uncovering the visual theft. Later that same week, Owen was wrapping up a grueling 10-hour editing session in his home studio. A former colleague forwarded him a secure link to a private investor portal. It was a digital pitch deck Dean was aggressively circulating to high-net-worth individuals across the state, soliciting heavy capital investments for Nolan Crest Living. Embedded right in the center of the presentation was a highly polished, 3-minute promotional video boasting about the firm's deep historical commitment to community rehabilitation. Owen called me into the room, his jaw tightly clenched. He pressed play. I watched in stunned silence as high-definition drone shots of low-income housing renovations filled the screen, interspersed with beautiful, emotional interviews of marginalized families receiving new home keys. It was a breathtaking piece of marketing. It was also entirely stolen. Every single frame of that footage belonged to a pro bono documentary Owen had shot and edited from the ground up 4 years prior for a completely different charity. Dean had somehow gained access to the Foundation's raw media archives, stripped Owen's protective watermarks, chopped up the emotional peaks of the film, and slapped a massive Nolan Crest Living logo right over the climax. He was actively monetizing my husband's charity work, packaging Owen's artistic brilliance, and selling it to wealthy investors as his own corporate track record. The sheer audacity of the video pushed me past professional caution and straight into a surgical investigation. If Dean was arrogant enough to steal digital assets, he was sloppy enough to leave a paper trail. I spent my entire weekend sitting on my living room floor, cross-referencing the publicly available vendor names listed on the Foundation's recent holiday event invoices against the state's digital business registration database. It took me exactly 14 hours of relentless clicking to find the rotting core of the apple. There, buried under 2 layers of obscure limited liability companies, was an event management firm registered entirely under Piper's name. It was one of her abandoned vanity projects from 3 years ago, a business that had never actually hosted a single event. Yet, according to the Foundation's recent public tax disclosures, this dormant company was suddenly receiving massive recurring payments labeled strictly as strategic consulting fees. Piper possessed absolutely no corporate consulting experience. She could not even balance her own personal checking account, let alone provide high-level strategic guidance for a multi-million-dollar housing fund. The reality was blindingly obvious. Dean was using my sister's defunct company as a financial pass-through entity. He was invoicing the Nolan Foundation for ghost services, funneling the donor money through Piper's clean name, and washing the capital to fund his own illicit operations. Whether Piper was genuinely naive to the money laundering happening under her own Social Security number, or whether she was smugly enjoying the massive influx of cash without asking questions, no longer mattered. She was fully legally compromised. Against my better judgment, I made one final attempt to pull the alarm. I called my mother on a Sunday evening and laid out the structural anomalies I had found in the public records regarding Piper's business. I did not raise my voice. I presented the facts with the sterile precision of an auditor. Celeste did not gasp. She did not ask for the documents. Instead, she unleashed a vicious, calculated psychological counterattack. She flatly rejected every single word I said. She accused me of harboring a sickly, pathetic habit of suspicion bred by my miserable bureaucratic job. She claimed I was desperately trying to sabotage my sister's happiness out of pure, unadulterated spite. And then, she went for the throat. She softly, venomously suggested that Owen's blue-collar bitterness was actively poisoning my mind, brainwashing me into turning against my own blood. I did not defend my husband. I did not defend myself. I simply let her finish her toxic monologue, wished her a good night, and terminated the call. I was entirely done trying to save people who were actively fighting to stay inside a burning building. From that moment forward, my emotional detachment was absolute. I became a ghost in the machine. I quietly saved her unhinged voicemails to a secure cloud drive. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the anomalous payment schedules. I printed out the state registry documents proving Piper's ownership of the shell company. Owen extracted the embedded metadata from Dean's stolen promotional video, proving definitively that the files originated from his personal hard drives years before Dean ever met my sister. We meticulously built an airtight, devastating legal dossier. It was a weapon forged from pure, indisputable data, perfectly designed to ensure that when the hammer finally fell, absolutely no one could dismiss me as an emotional, jealous daughter. We were just finalizing the last index of our files when the mail carrier dropped a heavy, familiar cream-colored envelope into our secure lockbox. It was the formal invitation for the upcoming annual Nolan Crest Christmas Gala. The heavy gold typography on the thick cardstock proudly announced that the highlight of the evening would be the grand public unveiling of Dean's new cooperative housing fund to the entire donor network. At the very bottom, printed in elegant cursive, was a strict dress code and a specific timeline. It mandated that all key family members gather in the grand parlor at 8 o'clock sharp for the official family portrait session. I stared at the embossed letters, a cold, sharp smile slowly spreading across my face. It was almost poetic. The universe, in all its dark humor, was intentionally reconstructing the exact same stage, the exact same lighting, and the exact same audience that had broken my life apart 1 year ago. They thought they were inviting the quiet, compliant daughter to stand in the back row and legitimize their massive fraud. They thought they were going to hand my husband a camera and force him to document their triumph. They were setting the stage for a celebration, completely unaware they had just mailed me the perfect venue for a public execution. The phone call came at exactly 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. When my mother's name flashed across the screen of my personal device, I let it ring 4 times before sliding my finger across the glass to answer. I expected the usual icy reprimand or the sharp, passive-aggressive silence she preferred when she felt defied. Instead, her voice drifted through the speaker with a spun sugar sweetness, a delicate, breathy octave she typically reserved for manipulating hesitant board members or placating wealthy widows at charity auctions. She spoke at length about the approaching holidays, about the changing of the seasons, and about her deep maternal desire for healing. She insisted she wanted the entire family to step into the new year as a completely united front, and then, she actually used the phrase water under the bridge regarding my husband. She spoke those words as if the systematic, decade-long erasure of his dignity was merely a silly, childish misunderstanding we had all mutually outgrown. She did not offer a single word of genuine apology. She simply declared the conflict magically resolved by her own decree, fully expecting my immediate and grateful compliance. She was setting the stage, sweeping the dirt under the rug so she could present a flawless floor to her investors. I agreed to attend the gala with a polite, non-committal hum, gave her a brief farewell, and ended the call. I knew better than to trust a sudden ceasefire from a woman who only negotiated when she needed ammunition. My suspicions were entirely validated exactly 48 hours later. A detailed logistics email arrived in my inbox, sent directly from my mother's newly hired personal assistant. The subject line boasted the minute-by-minute schedule for the upcoming Nolan Crest Christmas Gala. I scrolled past the lavish catering notes, the imported floral arrangements, and the valet parking instructions, dragging my cursor down to the designated VIP breakdown. There it was, printed in stark, arrogant black font. The category labeled family principals included Celeste, Martin, Piper, Dean, and myself. We were listed as a solid block of honored guests, complete with assigned seats at the head table. I kept scrolling down the screen. At the very bottom of the document, buried beneath the coat check attendants and the catering staff, was a section titled Photo and Video Support. Owen was listed right there. The itinerary explicitly instructed him to arrive 2 hours before the event to check the ambient lighting in the main ballroom and ensure the promotional backdrops were properly illuminated. The velvet glove had slipped entirely, revealing the exact same iron fist. The soft maternal phone call was not a white flag. It was a carefully constructed leash. They desperately needed my pristine corporate title to sit next to Dean, providing an aura of absolute legitimacy to appease any skeptical zoning commissioners in the room. And simultaneously, they expected my husband to gratefully put on a dark suit and film their grand, fraudulent charade from the shadows. They were simply wrapping their profound disdain in a slightly more polite administrative format. While I was staring at the deeply offensive itinerary, my cell phone buzzed against the desk. It was a direct, encrypted message from my father. It contained exactly 2 sentences. "Please come. I need someone to see things clearly." I read the text multiple times, feeling a familiar wave of exhausting disgust wash over me. It was the pathetic, desperate plea of a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, too paralyzed by fear to grab a bucket, begging his eldest daughter to come bail out the water for him. He intuitively knew Dean's financial projections were fabricated. He felt the trap rapidly closing around his wealth and his legacy, but he lacked the fundamental spine to overturn the dining table himself. He wanted me to be the villain. He wanted me to do the difficult, messy work of exposing the fraud so he could keep his own hands perfectly clean and avoid my mother's wrath. I found Owen in the kitchen, quietly wiping down the marble countertops after dinner. I walked over and handed him the printed itinerary without saying a word. He read the breakdown, his eyes scanning the bottom section. I watched his jaw muscles feather slightly, the only physical betrayal of the insult landing. He folded the paper, set it on the counter, and leaned heavily against the sink. He looked at me and offered a genuine, heartbreakingly gentle escape route. He told me that if I felt I needed to go, if I felt a lingering obligation to protect my father from his own foolish blindness, I should just go alone. He promised he would not be angry or resentful. He simply stated, with quiet but absolute finality, that he refused to put on a tuxedo and serve as a human prop for another night of high society theater. He was completely willing to stay home in the quiet comfort of our house so I could navigate the Nolan family minefield without constantly worrying about shielding him from their stray bullets. I looked at the man who had spent 9 years absorbing my family's casual cruelty just to keep my life peaceful. I shook my head, closing the physical distance between us. I told him in no uncertain terms that the era of me attending family functions as a solo act was permanently over. I made my boundary absolutely clear. I told him that we walk through those massive oak doors as a respected, unified married couple, or the Nolan family never gets to see my face again. I was done playing the compliant, useful daughter. We were going together, not as obedient guests, but as an absolute reckoning. The morning of the gala, I operated with cold, mechanical precision. I walked into the Summit Corridor Development Office and requested an immediate, closed-door meeting with our internal legal counsel. I did not rely on vague verbal assurances. I submitted a formal, written addendum to my previously filed conflict of interest report. I officially documented the gala invitation, explicitly stating on the corporate record that my attendance was purely a familial obligation and did not constitute any professional endorsement of Nolan Crest Living, its subsidiaries, or its new strategic advisor. I ensured my professional armor was locked perfectly and legally into place. Then, I went home and assembled the weapon. I did not bring messy, highlighted notes or emotional journal entries. I compiled a clean, sterile, devastatingly organized portfolio. I printed out the raw digital metadata logs, proving definitively that Dean stole Owen's documentary footage. I included the official state registry printouts, inextricably linking Piper's dormant shell company to the fraudulent consulting fees invoiced to the charity. I added the cross-reference timelines proving the theft of my philanthropic white paper. I slid the entire stack of damning documents into a sleek, unmarked leather folio. It was completely devoid of emotion or hysteria. It was simply cold, hard, unassailable data, resting quietly in my hands. As we dressed for the evening, adjusting our formal wear in the quiet sanctuary of our bedroom, Owen and I established our rigid rules of engagement. The heavy silence of the house amplified the gravity of our pact. Rule number 1 was absolute. Owen would not touch a single piece of audiovisual equipment, not even to adjust a leaning microphone stand or dim a harsh spotlight for a passing waiter. Rule number 2 dictated that we would not sign any non-disclosure agreements, guest registry books, or preliminary investment pledges, no matter who handed us the pen. Rule number 3 was a matter of tactical security. Neither of us would engage in a private, isolated conversation with Dean or my mother. Every interaction had to be witnessed in the wide-open spaces of the ballroom. And the final, most important rule governed our ultimate threshold. If my mother, my sister, or Dean attempted to push Owen to the margins, if they tried to physically or verbally erase him from the family frame even for a single second, we would not politely swallow the insult to save face. We would not wait for the car ride home to process the disrespect. We agreed that if they crossed that line, we would detonate the bridge right then and there. I smoothed the fabric of my evening gown. Owen adjusted his tie, and I picked up the heavy leather folio from the bed. We stepped out into the freezing December night, our breath pluming in the icy air. My mother thought she had beautifully set a trap for a compliant daughter. She had fundamentally miscalculated exactly who was being hunted. The grand gates of the Nolan estate stood wide open, welcoming a steady stream of imported black sedans. The sprawling mansion was ablaze with golden light, cutting fiercely through the freezing December darkness. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of imported winter orchids and the heavy, intoxicating aroma of expensive vintage wine. A live jazz quartet played a smooth, low-tempo melody from the corner stage, providing a sophisticated acoustic blanket over the murmurs of the region's most powerful political figures, wealthy philanthropists, and sharp-suited corporate attorneys. The entire scene was polished to a blinding, almost suffocating perfection. It looked exactly like a lavish cinematic set, beautiful on the surface, but entirely hollow beneath the floorboards. I stood near a towering crystal champagne tower, gripping the smooth leather of my folio, and watched the main actors take their marks. Dean navigated the crowded room with the terrifying ease of a man who believed he had already inherited the kingdom. He glided from cluster to cluster, clapping powerful men on the shoulder, leaning in to whisper charming anecdotes to their wives, and gesturing broadly toward the vaulted ceilings as if he had personally laid the bricks. Piper floated perpetually at his side, swathed in a metallic silver gown. She spent the entire evening finding creative ways to lift her left hand, ensuring the massive emerald-cut diamond engagement ring caught the light of the chandeliers. It was less a symbol of love and more a blinding declaration of victory. Hovering near the center of the room, my mother, Celeste, was practically incandescent. She wore a stunning sapphire dress and a smile so fiercely triumphant it bordered on predatory. She had finally acquired the perfect magazine-ready family she had always desperately craved, and she was bathing in the collective envy of her high society peers. I had only been in the room for 20 minutes when Dean smoothly detached himself from a group of banking executives and materialized at my elbow. The heavy scent of his expensive cedar cologne invaded my personal space before he even spoke. He gently touched my elbow, attempting to guide me away from the crowd toward a quiet alcove near the towering frosted windows. His voice was pure, spun velvet, carefully modulated to project intimacy and warmth. He thanked me for coming, layering on thick, syrupy praise about how stunning I looked. Then, he seamlessly pivoted to the true agenda of the night. He leaned in close and murmured that in about 45 minutes, they would be taking the main stage to officially announce the new cooperative housing fund. He asked, with a sickeningly sweet smile, if I would simply walk up the steps and stand directly beside him during the press photographs. He insisted that my presence, combined with my prestigious corporate title, would show the entire room a perfectly united family front. I looked directly into his perfectly symmetrical face. I did not shift my weight. I did not blink. I kept my voice entirely flat, stripped of even a single ounce of warmth or hesitation. I told him no. I stated clearly that I would remain standing exactly where I was, and I would not be participating in any promotional announcements for his corporate ventures. For the very first time since I had met him, the flawless, charming veneer cracked. It was a microscopic fracture, lasting perhaps only a fraction of a second, but it was incredibly revealing. His jaw tightened, the artificial warmth completely vanished from his eyes, and a flash of sharp, ugly impatience bled through. He gave a clipped, tight nod, his polite smile failing to reach his eyes, and swiftly turned on his heel to re-enter the crowd. He realized the compliance director was not going to play the compliance sister. While Dean was attempting to secure his human shield, Owen was quietly executing his own reconnaissance. Adhering strictly to our agreed-upon rules, my husband had completely ignored the technical staff setting up the lighting rigs. However, he had taken a slow, deliberate walk past the open doors of the main audiovisual control room situated just behind the main stage. He returned to my side a few minutes later, his shoulder brushing mine. He leaned his head down, his voice barely a whisper over the jazz music. He confirmed our worst suspicions. Playing on a continuous loop across the technician's primary preview monitors was the grand opening video Dean planned to broadcast to the entire room before his speech. Owen had seen his own artistic framing, his own intimate interviews, and his own raw documentary footage from a small, underfunded community project he had shot a year ago. It was violently chopped apart, stripped of its original context, and aggressively stamped with the gleaming new logo of Nolan Crest Living. Dean was preparing to stand on a stage and accept millions of dollars in investment capital based on a visual lie manufactured entirely from my husband's stolen labor. I nodded slowly, tightening my grip on the leather folio. The weapon was fully loaded. We just needed the right target to step into the crosshairs. As the evening progressed toward the highly anticipated presentation hour, I finally spotted my father. Martin Nolan looked like a ghost haunting his own house. He stood near the heavy oak entry doors, his tuxedo hanging loosely on his frame, his face drawn and pale. He was not greeting guests or holding court. His eyes were darting nervously around the room, constantly checking his gold pocket watch and staring out into the dark driveway. He was a man anticipating an execution, right on cue. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. 3 men stepped into the brilliant light of the foyer. They did not carry champagne flutes, and they did not mingle. 2 of them were the most prominent, ruthless private equity investors in the state of Colorado, men who commanded billions of dollars in capital and despised being lied to. The 3rd man was the independent forensic attorney I had advised my father to hire. They moved through the glittering crowd with silent, lethal purpose, taking up a position near the back of the room, their eyes locked directly on Dean. My father saw them arrive, let out a long, ragged exhale, and finally stopped looking at the door. The board was fully set. The jazz quartet abruptly stopped playing. A delicate chime echoed over the grand speaker system, signaling the guests to direct their attention toward the grand fireplace for the highly anticipated announcements. The crowd began to naturally part, creating a wide aisle for the family to take their designated marks. It was exactly the same stage. The massive stone hearth was roaring with fire. The towering spruce trees sparkled with thousands of tiny white lights, and standing right in the center, acting as the ultimate director of the family theater, was my mother. Celeste waved her hands, ushering the wealthy donors back to clear the frame. She called for Martin. She called for Piper. She called for me. And then, driven by a decade of unchecked arrogance and pure, reflexive habit, she turned toward the heavy mahogany side table. She picked up a massive, professional-grade digital camera. She turned directly toward my husband. Her voice carried loudly over the hushed, expectant crowd. She extended her arms, thrusting the heavy camera out toward Owen's chest. She offered him a bright, condescending smile and asked him to hold the device. She stated loudly that the official family photograph required absolutely everyone who actually maintained the public face of the company to be in the frame. The implication hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He was not family. He was not the face of anything. He was simply the invisible labor meant to document their glory. Before Owen even had a chance to decline the insult, Dean executed his move. He stepped forward with absolute, entitled confidence, sliding smoothly into the empty space directly beside me and my father. He stood exactly in the footprint where my husband had belonged for 9 long years. Last year, standing in this exact room, watching this exact maneuver, I had convinced myself it was a thoughtless mistake. I had believed it was a temporary lapse in judgment, a minor misstep I needed to silently absorb to keep the peace. But standing here tonight, bathed in the flashing lights and surrounded by a room full of sharks, I knew the absolute truth. It was not an accident. It was a perfectly executed, deliberate erasure. It was the physical manifestation of a family that valued a wealthy parasite over a decent, loyal man. Dean flashed his $1,000,000 smile toward the empty space where the camera was supposed to be, entirely confident that he had won the war. He had absolutely no idea that by stepping into that specific spot, he had just triggered the final trap. My mother's arm remained outstretched, the heavy digital camera dangling from her manicured fingers like a cursed offering. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the familiar, compliant rhythm of the Nolan family dynamic to play out. They expected my husband to graciously accept the role of the invisible servant. They expected me to swallow my pride and smile for the flashing bulbs, before Owen could even shift his weight or raise a hand to decline. I stepped forward. I did not move aggressively, but my stride carried an absolute, undeniable finality. I bypassed the camera entirely and stood directly in front of the massive stone fireplace, placing myself directly in the center of the stage. I pitched my voice to carry perfectly over the hushed murmurs of the gathered donors and executives. If tonight is about family principles, then maybe the room deserves the truth before the picture. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The lively chatter in the grand ballroom died entirely. The jazz quartet on the far side of the room abruptly stopped playing, the final note hanging awkwardly in the freezing air. My mother froze, her flawless smile shattering into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. For 36 years, I had managed every single family crisis behind heavily locked doors. I had smoothed over scandals in the kitchen, negotiated truces in parked cars, and absorbed insults over private phone calls. I had never, not once, dragged our ugly reality directly into the blinding light of the main stage. She simply could not process the rebellion unfolding in front of her. Owen did not take the camera from her trembling hand. Instead, he turned his back on the fireplace and walked with measured, deliberate steps straight toward the audio-visual control desk situated just adjacent to the stage. The hired technician stepped back in confusion. Owen reached into his jacket pocket, produced a heavy solid-state hard drive, and connected it directly into the master presentation terminal. He bypassed the polished, stolen promotional video Dean had queued up for the grand finale. With a few rapid keystrokes, Owen overrode the master display. The two massive digital projection screens flanking the fireplace flickered, and suddenly, they were completely filled with raw, unedited metadata logs. There were no emotional drone shots or soaring musical scores. The screens displayed stark white text against a pitch-black background, clearly showing the original creation dates, the proprietary copyright tags, and the exact digital signatures of the footage Dean was about to claim as his own. The dates stamped on the files were from over 4 years ago, long before Dean Holloway had even learned how to pronounce our family name. A heavy, confused murmur began to ripple through the crowd of wealthy investors. Dean's perfectly constructed posture faltered. He took a half step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture, opening his mouth to spin a charming, impromptu lie about clerical errors and media mix-ups. He never got the chance. I unzipped the sleek leather folio resting in my hands. I did not look at Dean. I walked directly past him and approached the independent forensic attorney my father had quietly brought into the room. I handed the lawyer the thick stack of meticulously organized documents. I spoke loud enough for the 2 billionaire private equity investors standing right behind the attorney to hear every single syllable. I presented the printed text messages where Dean explicitly begged for confidential municipal bidding schedules. I presented the highlighted state registry documents, definitively proving that Dean's newly formed consulting firm was inextricably linked to a dormant shell company registered entirely in my sister's name. I presented the heavily audited, unexplainable payment schedules detailing hundreds of thousands of dollars in fake consulting fees funneled directly from the charity's operating accounts into that exact shell company. The older of the 2 private equity investors leaned over the lawyer's shoulder, adjusting his reading glasses to peer at the top page. His face instantly darkened. He recognized the name of a secondary vendor listed in Dean's corporate web, loudly noting that the exact same entity had been involved in a massive, fraudulent commercial bankruptcy case 2 years prior. In less than 2 minutes, the blinding, charismatic aura Dean had spent 6 months carefully constructing completely disintegrated. The smooth, confident visionary vanished, entirely replaced by a cornered, desperate grifter caught directly in the headlights of undeniable forensic evidence. My father, Martin Nolan. finally stepped out from the shadows of the entry doors. He looked past my mother, past my sister, and locked eyes with the independent attorney. The lawyer gave him a single, grim nod. That silent confirmation was all my father needed. For the first time in my entire adult life, he stopped waiting for the weather to clear and actively became the storm. Martin walked to the center of the stage. He did not yell, but his voice possessed a heavy, gravelly authority I had never heard before. He announced to the entire ballroom that the Cooperative Housing Fund launch was permanently canceled, effective immediately. He publicly ordered the Foundation's chief financial officer to instantly freeze all operational accounts and revoke every single ounce of digital and physical access Dean Holloway possessed. Then, he turned to the two massive private security guards flanking the main doors and instructed them to escort the former strategic advisor off the estate property without allowing him to retrieve his coat. Dean tried to grab Piper's arm, an instinctive, pathetic attempt to use her as a human shield one last time, but the independent attorney stepped between them. The lawyer looked at my sister, whose face was completely drained of color, and calmly explained the brutal reality of her situation. He told her that her dormant event company had been actively utilized as a massive money laundering conduit. Dean did not just love her for her access to high society. He had methodically set her up to take the absolute worst of the federal felony charges if the financial audits ever caught up to him. Piper stared at the massive diamond ring on her left hand, the glittering symbol of her victory suddenly looking exactly like a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. She backed away from him, her hands covering her mouth in sheer horror. The security guards converged on the stage, gripping Dean firmly by the arms and physically marching him out of the grand ballroom. The silence they left in their wake was deafening. I finally turned to look at my mother. Celeste was standing perfectly still, the heavy digital camera now resting limply on the polished mahogany floor by her feet. Her eyes darted frantically from the empty space where Dean had just stood, up to the massive screens displaying Owen's undeniable creative genius, and finally over to the man she had spent a decade trying to erase. In that agonizing, silent moment, the absolute truth finally penetrated her armor. The devastating blow was not simply that a con artist had tried to steal their wealth. The true tragedy was that she had actively, willingly, pushed a loyal, brilliant, and deeply decent husband entirely out of the frame just to make room for a man who knew how to wear a tailored suit and play a perfect part. I did not scream at her. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg her for an apology or demand her long-overdue validation. I simply looked her directly in the eyes, my voice steady and completely void of the anxious daughter she once knew. I told her that I would never again trade my marriage, my professional integrity, or my husband's profound self-respect just to keep the Nolan family looking polished and perfect in a photograph. I turned away from the ruins of their grand empire. I reached out, my fingers wrapping tightly around Owen's warm hand. We did not wait for the stunned crowd to disperse, and we certainly did not wait for my parents to attempt a desperate, frantic reorganization of their shattered image. We walked straight out of the grand ballroom, our footsteps echoing loudly on the marble floors, leaving them entirely alone to deal with the ashes. A few weeks later, the lavish, highly anticipated Nolan family Christmas card never arrived in the mail. The glossy, high society mailing list was completely canceled. Instead, Owen and I sent out our own holiday greeting to a very small, select list of genuine friends. It was a simple, unfiltered photograph taken on the weathered wooden steps of our own front porch. We were both standing right in the center of the frame, wrapped in heavy winter coats, laughing genuinely at something out of shot. No one was relegated to the margins. No one was forced to hold the camera. And for the very first time in my entire existence, I realized that if my family ever wanted to be part of a beautiful picture again, they were going to have to find a way to walk back to me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us further by clicking the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by even more people.